Chris O'Connor here. Join our prestigious Curmudgeonly community on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/curmudgeonrock. Also be on the lookout for a Spotify playlist dedicated to this episode. Now let's get started.
This is the Curmudgeon Rock Report, and this is your podcast made by rock geek iconoclastic outsiders for rock geek iconoclastic outsiders. For those of you who lament that rock music has gone the way of jazz and slipped into niche genre status, we are here to keep that flame alive by providing insight, analysis, recommendations, and honest takes, not hot takes. And hey, there's a good chance you'll learn some rock history you never knew before. Earlier this year, we did a two-part special called The First Golden Age of Rock, which examined the rock and roll explosion of the 1950s that gave us Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Elvis Presley, etc., etc. Last year, we produced an ambitious 9-part series called The Fourth Golden Age of Rock, which took a look at how the alternative and indie rock uprising in both the US and the UK shaped rock music for the entire 1990s. Well, that leaves us with 2 more golden ages to tackle, right? That's exactly what we will start doing with this episode, the first of a 9-part series with episodes intermittently spread throughout with standalone episodes in between, called The Second Golden Age of Rock. What is the Second Golden Age, you might ask? Well, this is the period from the mid-1960s to the very early 1970s when everything, and I mean everything, changed for the world on a cultural level. We're obviously focusing on the music, but those changes in music at the time echoed, or perhaps even foreshadowed, the sweeping cultural changes the world saw in film, art, fashion, politics, and even technology. As far as music goes, the second golden age of rock saw rock and roll transform to quote-unquote rock music, and saw it become not just the soundtrack to a generation, but the soundtrack for a changing society. This episode will kick the series off in the year 1964, which is when the explosion of Beatlemania portended the arrival of British rock music as an international pop cultural force. We'll also discuss the rise of Bob Dylan and socially conscious music, the mainstreaming of the sweet R&B sounds of Motown and African American music into the pop cultural American consciousness, and, thanks to the Beach Boys, the solidification of surf rock as an American musical institution. So, sit back, relax, and feel the forces of time hurl you backwards to a more innocent time, and to the pivotal moment when the innocence of that time was about to be shaken and altered forever. Welcome to the Second Golden Age of Rock, 1964.
Come mothers and fathers throughout the land, and don't criticize what you can't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command. Your old road is rapidly aging. Please get out of the new one if you can't lend your hand, for the times, they are a-Changin. Bob Dylan introduced that famous sentiment about the nature of history itself into the record on January 12th, 1964, the date the album, The Times They Are a-Changin', was released. Now, that is one hell of a proclamation with which to launch the second golden age of rock. Now, isn't it, Arturo?
Yeah, I mean, and him and the Beatles basically are the two prominent figures that really kind of like launched that whole era and defined a generation, really.
Oh, absolutely. And so, welcome, folks, coincidentally, to the beginning of our intermittently presented second golden age of rock series. Longtime listeners will remember that we did a second golden age, or a fourth golden age of rock series about the 90s, which was really, really intensive and we were really proud of. And then we did a 2-part first Golden Age of Rock series about the 50s and very early 60s, which personally is one of my my proudest episodes, or I think one of my favorite episodes that we've done. So now we're in the one that counts, which is 1964 to 1972. I think that everybody will get massive enjoyment out of this. Any related thoughts, Arturo, before we commence?
Yes, I think before we continue, we need to do a quick RIP to two notable rock figures who died recently.
Yes.
One of them is Sinead O'Connor. The other one is the original Eagles bassist, Randy Meisner, who wrote my favorite Eagles song, "Take It to the Limit."
Yep. Yeah, with the most incredible falsetto that which is always funny because it was an incredible falsetto on record, but he couldn't replicate it live, which is why he got fired. Because
he wouldn't.
Yeah, well, he wouldn't do it. He was afraid to do it, and so Glenn Frey basically just said, "Fuck you," and fired him. And then poor Sinead. Sinead, she didn't have a fair life to begin with, but if she had ripped up a picture of the Pope in, like, say 2005,
she'd be a hero.
Yeah, but she did it in 1992, and that didn't go over very well. She got booed off the stage at a Bob Dylan tribute concert, which is funny because how many dirtbags were on that? We're on that bill. I mean, come on. It was like dirtbag after dirtbag after dirtbag. And she's the one that gets booed off the stage. We're now at that point where we cross over into the parallel universe. Here we are. You hear that spooky music. And the space-time continuum has ripped. And here we are where blue is green and white is black, and rock and roll is still awesome and predominates on the billboards. And, rock and roll is the thing over here. And in the parallel universe, this is a place where reviewing rock albums by new and newish artists is actually an awesome thing that people still... I used to buy subscribe to Rolling Stone, and about 75% of my motivation was the reviews.
Right.
And it was always my dream to get published in Rolling Stone for a review. It was the one place I never did get published. But anyway, I got published everywhere else except that. But anyway, very long-winded way of saying that Arturo and I cover new or newish albums by artists we think that you should be paying attention to. We also have what we call a parallel vault on this side, and that is
which is what I'm doing.
Yes, that is what Arturo is doing. That is our big giant Fort Knox safe full of our archives and our bag of really good goodies that we want you to know about. And the rule there is that they have to be within a decade of release. And that is what Arturo is doing. So if I am our resident King Gizzardologist, Arturo is now our resident Goatologist.
Yeah. Yeah, this is about the third time we've talked about this band now.
Yeah, exactly.
This in a parallel universe where rock music is still a big part of the pop culture, Goat would be a massive band. We've talked at length about the Swedish psychedelic rock band Goat. Both of yours truly, Curmudgeons, had their album "Oh Death" quite high on our lists of best albums of 2022. Earlier this year, I discussed their brilliant debut album from 2012, World Music, in a previous Parallel Vault segment. This time, in my ongoing quest to turn people on to this amazing band, I want to shine a light on their third album, 2016's Requiem. Whereas their early records sounded like a cross between the heavy-duty acid rock of peak Jimi Hendrix and the exotic rhythms of 1970s Afrobeat a la Fela Kuti, this Swedish collective made a radical departure for this album. On Requiem, they seem to have mostly left Africa behind, and they left it for the sounds of South American indigenous folk music, particularly the kind you'd hear from Colombia and Peru. while they don't completely abandon electric guitar jams, there is more than a healthy dose of acoustic guitar textures. In fact, you can say this is almost Goat Unplugged with a heavy South American folk bent. Like everything else this visionary band does, it's an intoxicating blend that reveals more and more upon each listen. You have the opening track, Diorlin / Union of Sun and Moon, with its orchestra of acoustic guitars and pan flute reverie. The African influence lingers on the lovely I Sing in Silence, which revels in the lilting, sun-kissed grooves of traditional South African music. There's Trouble in the Streets, which is a delectable slice of Caribbean dance pop, while Goat Band grooves on and on and on with a hypnotic, repetitive, psychedelic tinged trance. The penultimate track, Goodbye, does the same with all acoustic instruments. Requiem is a rich and powerful album of sublime beauty that I think just gets better the more and more you listen to it. Chris?
Oh, no doubt. And for what it's worth, the ideal customer persona that Arturo has in mind for turning people on to Goat is me. And so far it has worked. This is one hell of a party record.
Yeah.
I'll admit that, like you said, the the South American rhythms.
Yeah.
Although I kind of, in a way, I kind of saw this as what if San Francisco and Graceland had a kid? It had that kind of feel to it.
Yeah.
It's a remarkably fun and adventurous record with some kick-ass guitar stuff and some kick-ass rhythm. I mean, the percussion stuff in there, and not only that, but the backup singers. There's this chant. The female singers, there's almost this chant, like trance-like quality to some of it that they go in and out of. It's a very zigzag record. This isn't really a complaint more than it is a lament. I wish that they, like, the first, I guess, quarter of the record, third of the record, ain't no party like a Ren Fair party. Just where they're heavy on the woodwinds. They're heavy on the woodwinds, and they're heavy on the merriment and the mirth in terms of the chant. And so I just get this picture of like a giant, like drunken Renaissance fair flute off around a bonfire. I kind of wish they had gotten the whole record out of that, because that would have been just kind of fascinating. Yeah, you're 3 for 3 with me on Goat. This is my favorite of the record so far. I'll admit, because this record just kind of fits my. I always kind of say funk and punk and percussive. If it falls into one of those, chances are your boy Christopher O'Connor will enjoy it immensely. So there you go. Another triumph on the Goat campaign tour for Arturo. And now I guess I'm going to launch one of my own tours, which is a celebration of Killer Mike, the rapper,
Right.
who is just a phenomenal performer. Most people that listen to this podcast will recognize him as one half of the incredible sort of underground hip hop. I guess you can call him like indie hip hop collective known as Run the Jewels. He's the big dude from Atlanta, not the white guy.
Right.
So he has released an album within the last couple of months called Michael. And as you can imagine, it's ostensibly as autobiographical as the name would suggest. So here's my take on this record. Killer Mike is one of the best rappers in the world, and his new album, Michael, is a fire hose. The Atlanta-bred and reared rapper, now one of hip-hop's true wise men and elder statesmen, he's about our age, in his 40s, spouts relentlessly over the span of 14 songs and 53 minutes about black pride, anger, sorrow, his own bad history, unwanted pregnancy, weed, the condition of the black community, righteous anger over all the people who don't just get it, and anything else that was on his mind when he stepped into the booth. He spits all those bars over beats that combine old soul samples and references with oddly trap beats and an overall psychedelic aesthetic. It's a dirty Southapalooza, in other words, really mostly inspired by the Dungeon family wing of the old Dirty South. That's the one with Outkast and the Goody Mob and Organized Noise. Now, highlights of this record include album opener Down by Law, in which CeeLo Green croons over old school horns while Mike pulls off the neat trick of rhyming verse after verse that ends with the words my N-word, my N ... A. It's actually pretty impressive how he keeps it going. And then there's also the song Run, where comedian Dave Chappelle gives Mike a shout out for his community leadership. And then Mike moves through a slow burning call to action. It's actually kind of it's a neat little song. It's reminiscent of some of the stuff Run the Jewels has done in terms of its kind of weird, kind of start and stop, but slow, menacing tempo. And then Andre 3000, of all people, from Outkast, makes a surprise appearance on the suitably weird Scientists and Engineers, an EDM spike tune with the occasional nonsense lyric, which I guess it makes sense that Andre would be on this record, considering that Outkast gave Killer Mike his big break as a guest rapper on some of their latter catalog songs in the early 2000s. And then what I think is the best song on the record, there's a song called it's called Something for Junkies, which is a really kind of moving tribute to all of the addicts in his life and throughout Atlanta, and just sort of acknowledging, their pain, their struggle, and their humanity. So honestly, I think this will probably be the best pure hip hop record I hear all year. So get on your hustle and check it out yourself, Arturo.
Yeah, I mean, I love Killer Mike. I'm a big fan of Run the Jewels. To me, this album, it's not bad at all. I think it's all right. I like it. It's just, I just don't think it's that great. It's a little too much gospel for my tastes. I think the juxtaposition with trap, like you mentioned earlier before we started recording, I don't think it wears well on this record. The rhymes and the lyrics aren't always that great, which is a little disappointing considering who it is. It's Killer Mike. The guy's great, usually. And there are a few too many lyrics where he's taking shots at his critics, where it isn't really necessary, because, he's a big time, socially conscious, progressive, liberal artist. And I guess some people have complained, oh, yeah, you're rich and famous and you're complaining about, about the plight of the poor, blah, blah, blah. You're contradictory. It's like, so what? They're not worth your trouble, Mike.
Chris here again. We usually end our episodes by inviting you to join our Curmudgeonly community page on Facebook. Well, we're picking up our efforts there. Know people just as passionate as us about rock and roll? Invite them to join in the fun. You don't actually need our permission to do so. Also, expect to see a lot more content up there moving forward. Our mission is to engage you, so darn it, we'll engage you like a fire hose, or maybe like a firehouse if we're going to give love to Gene Simmons. We may also be making a few offers. Want to wear a t-shirt featuring our logo? You may have that opportunity soon. So be a fellow curmudgeon, help us expand our little community, and share your own musings via your own posts. We're at facebook.com/groups/curmudgeonrock.
So why are we starting the second golden age of rock in 1964? Well, if you listen to a lot of artists and musicians who came of age in that era, or who would go on to do greater things, of course, and great things, they always talk about, a lot of them, almost to a man and woman, talk about how the moment that made them want to pick up a guitar or a keyboard or get a microphone and sing or whatever, or be a part of a band even. A lot of them say that catalyst moment was seeing the Beatles on Ed Sullivan on February, whatever the day was in 1964. And for a lot of people, that really was what kickstarted the 1960s. Really, the 60s, you can say, really began in 64 when the Beatles arrived in America. Granted, they were already popular in the UK and in a lot of parts of Europe in 1963. But in 1964 is when the Beatles went international, and their fame and popularity and their hit music spread and infected the minds and the hearts of so many people around the world, and inspired so many people to get into music, either write about it or be part of it and be musicians themselves. And it really kind of kickstarted the counterculture in a lot of ways. Rebelling against your parents isn't a new thing. In the 1950s, we covered that in the first golden age of rock with the whole Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Elvis thing. But the Beatles, they almost kind of transcended racial barriers, because even Black people were kind of enjoyed and respected the Beatles. They were these aliens. They weren't American. They were from this other world. You know, in early 1960s America, if you weren't American, you might as well be from another world. And when the Beatles arrived, they really did change that. Garage rock started after the Beatles hit America. A brand new interest in rock and roll started in America after the Beatles arrived. Rock and roll music itself took on a whole different shape, form, and sound after the Beatles arrived in America. So it really is the demarcation point for that baby boomer generation and for a whole new rock and roll era that really opened the doors up until the early 70s. And that 8-year span really influenced and changed everything that came afterward. That's why we're starting in 64.
Well said. And good job of minimizing the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Kennedy assassination, by the way.
Well, I mean, Bob Dylan took that on. We will get to that later.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is I think the people would say that the 60s might have started with one of those, but
sure.
Hey, but for our purposes, the 60s in music became the 60s because before that you had like Neil Sedaka and whatever was left of Little Richard and Chuck Berry. So pretty much. So
and Elvis doing bad movies.
Yeah, and Elvis doing bad movies. So on that note, let's talk a little bit more about the Beatles. I mean, you set this up pretty well, Arturo, but here's my own take on Beatlemania. And when we talk about the Beatles in 1964, what we really are talking about is Beatlemania. We're not talking about the greatness of the Beatles. And so let's talk about this a little bit. So two propulsions really thrust the second golden age of rock into being, as I see it. We'll talk about the other one in a bit, but here's the first. The Beatles landing in America and playing the Ed Sullivan Show on February 9th, 1964. They made several appearances, but the first one and the most famous one where they did I Want to Hold Your Hand was on the 9th. Lots of girls screamed their heads off. Now, here is a wonderful ode to these screaming girls by the author Rob Sheffield from his amazing book, Dreaming the Beatles. Quote, "The screamers have all the fun. The Beatles, more than any other performers, tapped into the scream as the girls they once imagined became real. The Beatlemaniac girls remain the most famous screamers in history, more than the teens who screamed for Elvis, the Bobby Soxers who swooned for Frank, and the Directioners who scream now for Harry or Lewis. When you look at any footage of the Beatles live, you look for the girls in the crowd, convulsing and diving in divine ecstasy. Those girls were heroes, pioneers on the rock and roll frontier. They invented the Beatles and all that followed. Once you step inside the screen, you get transformed into a different person. The Beatles spent years there." Now, that's a pretty fair assessment. It certainly did help that the Beatles came armed with a gaggle of amazing songs, covers, and singles released throughout 1963. Please Please Me, Love Me Do, All My Lovin', Do You Want to Know a Secret, Twist and Shout, She Loves You, and in December of 1963, I Want to Hold Your Hand. Now, the two British albums from 1963, Please Please Me and With the Beatles, were not especially great, but boy, were those individual nuggets fucking great.
Yeah.
Coming into 1964, Beatlemania was indeed firmly a thing over in Britain and increasingly the rest of the world, with, again, I Want to Hold Your Hand hitting airwaves in late December of 1963. EMI's brass finally forced a reluctant Capitol Records to admit that in the States and release Meet the Beatles with an exclamation point, which is essentially a decover versionized version. It's a decover versionized version of the British album With the Beatles, and they released that in January. That album went from number 92 on the Billboard 200 on February the 1st to number 1 by February 15th. Obviously, that overlaps that first appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show, which, by the way, is on YouTube. I encourage everybody to go watch that performance. It's pretty special. And so the explosion happened, and the band occupied the first 5 slots on Billboard's Hot 100 on April 4th. No joke, look it up. And the ridiculous movie A Hard Day's Night hit with its amazing soundtrack in the summer, and the rest from there was a remarkable history that's been told so many damn times. All we'll do here is admire the narrative you already know. Arturo?
Yeah, I think one thing I want to add here is the album itself, A Hard Day's Night.
Oh, yeah.
I will argue that it is popular music's first truly perfect album.
Oh, yeah.
From beginning to end, it is the first truly immaculately flawless album. If the world ended at the end of 1964, that would be the greatest album of all time.
Although I don't know, the Ray Charles country record is pretty damn good too.
No, not as good as this. I'm sorry. What the Beatles did is that they took that great 1950s rock and roll, and they took their love of R&B and soul, particularly the Motown variety. They augmented the two of them together. They adapted it, and they made it into this, and they made it sophisticated. They created a brand new, sophisticated form of popular music using 1950s rock and roll and early 1960s soul. And that's what they did. That was their first of many to come innovations. And the immediate fruit of that was A Hard Day's Night, the soundtrack / album. And it's there's not a single wasted note of music on that album at all. If anyone says, oh, early Beatles are kind of cheesy, shut the fuck up. Get over your cynicism. Listen to A Hard Day's Night. And if you say anything bad about it, it says something bad about your individual taste in music. Period.
Yeah. I certainly concur. I would also say that A Hard Day's Night was probably Paul's peak.
Maybe. I would say maybe Revolver Peppers would be his peak.
Yeah, I mean, you can arguably say that, but Hard Day's Night, I mean, he's got like several songs on there, like Can't Buy Me Love.
Sure.
Which, and I Love Her is on that record.
Things We Said Today, maybe my favorite of his songs on that.
Oh, album. Yeah. I mean, just some perfect, just beautiful stuff on that record. And it's a fun record. There's an energy to it that they rarely captured. Again, there's a synergy. I think the right word is synergy, that I think that they reached again on Rubber Soul and Revolver, but they certainly didn't get to that synergy afterwards.
Yeah.
You're right. It is worth mentioning A Hard Day's Night. That was they released 2 records in 64. We'll talk about the other one in a bit later in this episode, but A Hard Day's Night is a masterpiece. The movie itself is silly, but so what?
Oh, I think it worked. I mean, it is silly, but it's silly in an art house, weird, skewered kind of way. Yeah, I think it really. I love that movie. I think it captures the essence of what that early Beatlemania rage is all about. And I mean, the stars of the 4 Beatles, the two who stand out with their personalities are John Lennon and Ringo Starr.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. Ringo is hilarious in that movie.
Yeah.
for sure.
Ringo
So,
was the best actor of the four.
well, yeah, I mean, and then yeah, and he proved it with that brilliant classic Caveman in
Yeah.
1981. Doo doo, caca, shit. Okay. There's your Easter egg for the episode right there. Some love. I'm kind of aging myself there, folks, but Caveman, you gotta love it. So, as most of you know, the Beatles they opened the floodgates for the British folks, and they were not the only British band that made their mark in 1964. Correct, Arturo?
Yeah, I mean, with Beatlemania, they basically opened the floodgates for the British invasion. I mean, for a lot of people, the Beatles defined the British invasion. For some people, they were the British invasion. But in 1964, other bands started trickling through, and three in particular: the Rolling Stones, the Kinks, and the Animals. Right now, let's start with the Rolling Stones first. Now, history has seemed to forever codified the Rolling Stones as the yang to the Beatles yin, the bad guys to the Beatles good guys, the supposedly second greatest band of all time, the second great British pantheon band, yada, yada. It may be hard for people to believe, but in 1964, the Stones were just an afterthought, at least in the US. In the UK, they had risen to prominence as basically an R&B, blues, and early rock and roll covers band. In their early years, they basically raided the Chess Records catalog for their repertoire.
Yeah, pretty much.
Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Bo Diddley, Chuck Berry, not to mention Jimmy Reed, Little Walter, etc., etc. What separated the Stones from the many, and I mean many, British bands throughout Great Britain during the same thing, doing the same thing, is that they did it really, really fucking well.
Oh yeah.
They brought a ragged intensity to their sound that lent their interpretations an authenticity that so many of the other bands lacked. They had a ragged look too, with their shaggy bowl haircuts, scruffy, pared down stage attire, and frankly, they weren't very good looking. During this early period, they presented themselves as essentially having three frontmen. The two guitarists, Brian Jones and Keith Richards, had menacing, quiet charisma that oozed from the stage. And of course, their lead singer, Mick Jagger, with his googly eyes, his big ass lips, as Eddie Murphy would say, and his slinky stage maneuvers, had a mesmerizing presence that immediately marked him as one of rock music's all-time great frontmen and frontmen to come. While they were already becoming a big thing in the UK, the Stones didn't start making their mark internationally and in the US until they released It's All Over Now in the summer of 1964.
Yep.
Originally a song by American soul singer Bobby Womack, it was their first UK number one and went up to number 26 on the US Billboard pop chart. It's a kick-ass, chugging rock and roll number, most musically notable for its chiming double guitar intro and the aggressive riff that rides the song out toward the end. Lyrically, it's very much in line with a lot of Stones songs at the time. Girl done me wrong, now I'm going to pay her back, make her cry, blah, blah, blah. However, the real crossover hit would come later in the fall when Time Is on My Side cracked number 6 on the US Billboard chart. Written by writer and producer Jerry Ragovoy, my mistake, Jerry Ragovoy, and originally recorded by jazz artist Kai Winding the previous year. It became a moderate R&B hit for Southern soul singer Irma Thomas earlier in 1964. Her version is full of gospel rapture, but when the Rolling Stones got their hands on it, they injected it with a sense of boyish yearning and a sweet innocence, sweetness, I dare say, that they were never really known for. Jagger even kisses the track with a spoken word recitation in the bridge, something you wouldn't hear on a Stones single again until the late 1970s. Their true star turn and conversion into one of the world's biggest bands would come in the next year. But in 1964, especially with the first two studio albums, The Rolling Stones and 12 by 5, the band that would become, quote unquote, the greatest rock and roll band in the world had to settle for being the world's greatest white boy R&B covers band. Chris?
Yeah, which still ain't a bad place to be. Here's a little bit of trivia for you. It's all over now. That Bobby Womack's band was called the Valentinos, and they recorded and they had released this song, and it charted in the Hot 100. It reached its peak or first hit the top 10 on like the 26th of March. Well, or the 27th of March. Well, the Stones had caught wind of this in an American tour like 4 weeks before this, and loved the song so much they managed to turn around that recording that quickly, so that their single hit the street on the 27th,
right,
and ultimately became the bigger hit. More trivia: the Womack version produced by Sam Cooke. And in Peter Goralnik's biography, Dream Boogie, on Sam Cooke, which we'll be talking about later in the episode, kind of funny that like Womack was pissed because he's like, "Who the fuck is this white guy that's doing this to me?" And like Sam Cooke is like, "What are you worrying about? This guy's going to be a star. They got their own thing." And then, of course, Womack made a shitload of money. So
they can take any song of mine they want.
Yeah, I was going to say he's bitching out of his own pride. Ain't no white boy gonna supersede me. Yeah, well, if he makes you a shitload of money, then shut your ass up. So that's really the Stones in '64. If you're the best white boy blues cover band in the world, hey, they could have made a whole career out of that. But luckily they got sophisticated and became the best ever to do the original take on the blues rock thing.
Right. They became the best white rock and roll band ever, basically.
Yep.
All right. The next band in our British invasion, let's face it, 2 or 3 levels below the Beatles, but they still trickled. The Kinks. As hard as it may be to believe for a lot of people, but for a brief moment in 1964, it was the Kinks and not the Rolling Stones who were seen as the clearest challengers to the Beatles' World Heavyweight Championship. And this was mainly due to the monumental success of 2 singles released that year, You Really Got Me and All Day and All of the Night. The Kinks may be the only band to have the distinction of having sown the seeds for what would eventually become both heavy metal and punk. How?
Yeah.
Just listen to those songs, man. And especially listen to the distorted, heavy as shit guitar sound on both of those tracks that still sounds fantastic today. The Kinks were your classic 2 guitars, bass, drums lineup. But the brain trust of the group lay in the guitar-playing brothers, rhythm guitarist, lead singer, older brother Ray Davies, and lead guitarist, younger brother Dave Davies. Like all British bands of this time, they played their fair share of blues and R&B covers. But Ray had a penchant for writing original songs that seeped into the band's repertoire. In fact, in very short due time, Ray Davies would go on to become one of the single greatest songwriters England would ever produce.
Oh, no doubt.
Right up there with the hollowed Lennon-McCartney duo. However, in 1964, the Kinks were still finding their footing as a band when a happy accident in the recording studio would not only change their lives, but change the course of rock history. Dave Davies mistakenly sliced the speaker cone of his guitar amplifier with a razor, and upon poking the cone with a pin, he heard this wild, distorted sound. Voila! Heavy rock was born, and the laid-back 12-bar blues song Ray Davies had written on piano was transformed into a power chord-driven, certifiable rock monster. Although Ray wrote You Really Got Me, and its orgiastic buildup from the verse to the chorus certainly drives the song, it's Dave's original guitar sound and wild, rollicking solo that dominate the track. It hit #1 in the UK and #7 in the US. They followed that up with All Day and All of the Night, arguably a better song with a groovier melody and that now patented guitar sound that drove the single to #2 in the UK and #7 in the US. The Kinks really were one of the pioneers of what we know now as garage rock. The Kinks would go on to have one of the most peculiar and tumultuous stories in the annals of rock, along the way becoming a singularly important and influential band in the development of indie rock and Britpop. But their early singles and their heavy as shit sound put them in the forefront of rock and roll innovation in 1964. Chris?
Oh, yeah. It's kind of funny to me that like two of the great innovations, guitar innovations of all time are Dave Davies accidentally inventing the fuzz box and Tony Iommi losing part of his finger, which really kind of led to not just the down tuning, but also kind of the way he could bend, his unique way of bending the string. So just kind of funny. And it is kind of interesting that the band that really is these days is more renowned for its Village Green, Waterloo Sunset phase,
right?
Hit the licensing dual jackpot of You Really Got Me and All Day and All of the Night. So it's like one of the great dichotomies in rock and roll history. And Ray Davies, he's a genius, and he was originally a rock star, and then he became anything but. And then of course, him and Dave for a while there had a nice habit of sabotaging each other in the studio because they hated each other's guts
for a while, throughout their entire lives.
Yeah, pretty much. But it got so bad that like what would happen is like there was some album, it might have been low budget, but there was an album where Ray would do his overdubs and Dave would then come in and erase him and do his, and then Ray would come in and erase Dave's and do his again, and vice versa. It's just very, very funny. So
we'll talk more about the Kinks in future segments of this second Golden Age series. They completely changed their sound as the decade went on.
Oh yeah.
All right. The next and final of these British invasion bands that trickled after the Beatles, the Animals. The Animals would go on to have moderate success throughout the 1960s as a second-tier British invasion band. And it's probably because they peaked so early in their career with a song that they never really could top. House of the Rising Sun is an old traditional folk song about losing one's innocence in a New Orleans brothel whose authorship is unknown. It's believed to have originated from the Appalachian Mountain region in the 1930s, but considering how there are several old English folk songs referring to whorehouses with the name Rising Sun, it's likely that its origin goes back to the UK. The oldest known recording of the song under the title Rising Sun Blues is from 1933 by Appalachian folk artists Clarence Ashley and Gwen Foster. From there, versions of the song went from country legend Roy Acuff to folk legend Woody Guthrie to Josh White to two different versions recorded by blues folk icon Leadbelly, to Glenn Yarbrough, to Pete Seeger, to Andy Griffith, yes, that Andy Griffith, to South African singer Miriam Makeba. Joan Baez recorded it in 1960. Nina Simone recorded it for a live album in 1962. And in that year, folk singer Dave Van Ronk had prepared a brilliant, simmering, slowed down arrangement of the song that was making waves in New York's Greenwich Village folk scene at the time. Bob Dylan would steal that arrangement from Van Ronk for his own rendition on his self-titled debut album in 1962. However, 2 years later, It would be a little-known bluesy R&B combo from Newcastle, UK, that would electrify the song in a rock band setting and have a worldwide smash hit with it, forever making their version the definitive version of House of the Rising Sun. In the hands of the Animals, and particularly with singer Eric Burdon's smoldering, soulful delivery and powerhouse vocal range, it became a soaring, climaxing morality tale of almost biblical proportions. It went to #1 on both the UK and US charts and became an instant classic. In a short span of 1 year, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Kinks, and Animals became the four-headed beast of the British invasion that threatened to take over the world. And the majority of the established acts on the American pop music scene had good reason to worry. Chris?
Yeah, they did. House of the Rising Sun, awesome song. And Eric Burdon was a hell of a singer. And so, like you said, they had modest success, but it was always defined by Burdon's vocals. And then, of course, by the end of the decade, he did Eric Burdon and War, which, Spill the Wine and some of that stuff, which is just really, really fantastic. But yeah, I mean, they were like kind of a second-rate band that had a first-rate hit. Speaking of which, I need to do a roll call. So we have the British invasion of '64, and I think you're giving some short shrift to some people here. So here is a roll call of top 20 hits from British artists in 1964. Some of which will sound very, very, very familiar to most of you. Dusty Springfield's "I Only Want to Be With You." Dave Clark Five's "Bits and Pieces." Peter and Gordon's "A World Without Love." Manfred Mann, "Doo-Wah Diddy Diddy."
They didn't really have a big hit until they covered Springsteen many years later.
Yeah, but that actually got to that spent a week at #1.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, or it spent some time up there. The Zombies, "She's Not There."
Yeah, were they British?
They were British.
Wow, I forgot about the Zombies. That was a big hit.
That was a huge hit. And one more song to mention, Herman's Hermits, "I'm Into Something Good."
Ew, they suck though.
Yeah, I know. I mean, that's probably the worst of these songs, but it's probably one of the more well-known songs from this whole bunch. So yeah, hell of a year for Britannia here in the States,
and it would get better too.
And it would get better and better and better and better and better all through the second golden age of rock. So pretty incredible.
Well, we mentioned the not so much the influence, but the permeation of Bob Dylan. Chris, on to you about Mr. Zimmerman.
Yes. And so, yeah, we opened this episode with that bit from The Times They Are A-Changin', which is the opening song on the record that he released in January of 1964. So he comes into this year as a champion still of the folk movement. By this time, he had written several timeless folk anthems, and by then was firmly the successor to Woody Guthrie. Now, his album, The Times They Are A-Changin', which, as we said earlier, again, January '64, seems on the surface to continue his position of strength as that champion. Emphasis on "seem to." Now, listen closely, and you will hear a rock artist yearning to be free in his own poetic and profound way. For instance, take the lovely "One Too Many Mornings" and this lyric, quote, it's a restless, hungry feeling, and it don't mean no one no good. When everything that I'm saying, you can say it just as good. You're right from your side, and I'm right from mine. We're both just one too many mornings and 1,000 miles behind. Incredible sentiment there. Or you take album closer, "Restless Farewell." Quote, "Oh, every girl that ever I've touched, I did not do it harmfully, and every girl that I have ever hurt, I did not do it knowingly, but to remain as friends, you need the time to make amends and stay behind. And since my feet are now fast and point away from the past, I'll bid farewell and be down the line. So maybe the release of Another Side of Bob Dylan in August 1964 should not have been much of a shock. I mean, if you were really listening, maybe it was not that much of a shock. But the main shock really is that other side of Bob Dylan revealed a nasty son of a bitch, albeit one with previously untapped gorgeous melodies. I mean, the album begins with the desperately, maybe creepily romantic All I Really Want to Do, and ends with the aloofer than thou breakup song, It Ain't Me, Babe. There's hardly anything or politically charged. There's hardly anything political or revolutionary about it. Well, I mean, revolutionary from the societal change point of view anyway, besides like Chimes of Freedom. But Dylan had at this point, officially moved on from the movement, and in doing so, reinvented rock and roll as a personal and poetic mode of expression.
Well, we at this point reinvented folk music. He hadn't quite gone into rock and roll.
Yeah, no, he hadn't done Maggie's Farm yet. That was the next year. Yeah. But to me, this is, I mean, it does reinvent rock and roll. Why? Because it has its followers and people are listening. It really was a seismic shift. So you have to remember, so by year's end, the influence was starting to show across the rock spectrum. Conventional wisdom usually holds that the paradigm shift occurred with the Byrds' Mr. Tambourine Man and the Beatles' Rubber Soul the next year in 1965.
Not true.
Nope. Take, for instance, the Beatles for Sale, which the Beatles released near the very end of 1964.
Oh, Chris, before you go there, can I add something that will give credence to your argument?
Sure.
Before the Beatles recorded that album, they were on the road constantly in 1964, as you would imagine. And it was in July or August of 1964 that they met Bob Dylan for the first time.
Oh, yeah.
They were already listening to Bob Dylan's records, particularly the freewheeling Bob Dylan and the Times They Are a-Changin'. They met him for the first time in a hotel room and in New York City. And it was the four Beatles, Brian Epstein, Dylan, and one of Dylan's friends / contacts. And it was Bob Dylan who introduced the Beatles to marijuana.
There you go.
There you go.
And it certainly does help with this mood. Now, the Beatles for Sale, as I was saying, they released that near the end of 1964. That's the real turning point for them in terms of embracing introspection and a deeper shade of poignancy.
I'm a loser.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, hell, John Lennon cut to the chase and flat out labeled a growing Dylan theme, naming a song, I'm a Loser.
Right.
Other than a backfilling of covers by Chuck Berry, Carl Perkins, and a couple of others, the new songs on Beatles for Sale are mostly acoustic and are all lovely. Even the up-tempo, cleverly worded 8 days a week fit that bill.
Also, Babies in Black, that's a sad song.
Yeah, absolutely. And then one of my favorite McCartney songs is on that record too, I'll Follow the Sun.
Sure.
Is on that as well. Just beautiful lyric on that. And also of note, we should mention that Simon and Garfunkel released Wednesday 3 a.m. Late in 1964. Though it did not find commercial success until 2 years later, the album is notable for hosting an early solely acoustic version of The Sounds of Silence, inarguably one of the great folk rock songs ever made, with its opening line, Hello, Darkness, my old friend. So the times indeed were a-changing in ways way more incredible than Dylan's legion of folky fans ever imagined possible. Arturo?
Yeah, just two quick things. And about those two albums that Dylan put out in 1964. The freewheeling Bob Dylan gets a lot of the press and a lot of the hype and the historical love.
Deservedly so.
But I think the two albums he put out in '64 were better, in my opinion. The Times They Are a-Changin' from 1964. People need to realize how dark of a record that is. The darkest, and I would say the angriest, and maybe the most political of his early folk period. You have the title track, which is anthemic. You have With God on Our Side, which is his commentary on the Cold War and how, America is supposed to be the good guy, yet we've done so many bad things in our political history. There's Only a Pawn in Their Game, which is his commentary on how the ruling elite corporate superclass manipulates both poor white and black people to hate each other. He talks about The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll, which is his song about a rich white guy who beats his black female servant to death and gets away with it in court. You have a Ballad of Hollis Brown about a poor guy. We don't know if he's white or black, but he's so poor, cannot care for his wife and kids, kills them all, then kills himself in the end. That's a pretty
it's some dark shit. Yeah, no, I'll admit.
But it's poetically rendered with the brilliant choice of words, brilliant diction, brilliant rhyme scheming, and just powerful emotion behind it. And then you have Another Side of Bob Dylan, came out later in 1964. Dylan was already smoking pot by then, but what a lot of people don't know is that this is Bob Dylan's first post-acid album. He had already taken acid by this point, and you can hear it in the words, the surrealism that he became known for in his mid-60s work with the electric period. You start to hear it really on this one. You hear it in the lyrics. You hear it in Chimes of Freedom. You hear it in Motorcycle Nightmare. Hear it in his vivid description of the streets of New York in Spanish Harlem Incident. It's really there. And of course, it's also the album where Dylan starts getting personal, but he's also starts to get acid tinged as well. Maybe the LSD is what led him to get more personal. Who knows? Chicken or the egg? We don't know what came first. But yes, that's what Another Side of Bob Dylan represents as well. Yeah,
it has one of my favorite Dylan lyrics on it. Then I was so much older then. I'm younger than that now.
Yeah, there you go.
I mean, talk about surrealism. For sure. So Dylan's effect. And so those are the two main punches. There's basically there's the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, and Dylan coming out with Another Side of Bob Dylan.
And the large number of people who covered his songs during this time and had moderate chart hits with them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And when the ball really got rolling with that in 65. 65. If it wasn't for Dylan in 64, 1965 would not have been 1965. Fair to say?
Right. But we'll talk about that in a future episode for sure. On this episode, we gave you the first installment of our 9-part series, The Second Golden Age of Rock, in which revolutionary changes in rock music portended revolutionary changes in society as a whole. Well, for the next episode, we're going to cover a different kind of revolutionary change in music that was no less important. It started in block parties in the Bronx, New York in the 1970s, where DJs would spin records by R&B, soul, and funk artists, often blending and mutating the sounds into one continuously danceable soundtrack. Soon, some seriously creative people would improvise vocals over these manipulated records, and these vocalizations would take on a life of their own, eventually evolving into the art form known as rapping. Yes, folks, we're talking about the beginnings of the genre known as hip-hop, a genre which would eventually alter the face of popular music forever. Join us next time as the Curmudgeon Rock Report does some forensic research into the birth of hip-hop.
Now, from here, we kind of start getting into one of the more fascinating elements of 1964, which is you have a rapid maturation of not just white rock and roll, but also of black soul and R&B, and they seem to go in parallel in terms of the sophistication curve, but also the rapidity of the development and the rapid fire nature of everything, that all of this brilliant music just sort of hitting the street almost like a neutron bomb. And it's both in white music and black music, and nowhere in black music was this more apparent than with I guess you could say, the continuing rise and probably Motown's finest year in 1964. So, Arturo, talk to us about Motown.
I think Motown's finest year was 1966, but that's another discussion. It's impossible to overstate the importance of the Motown record label on both a musical and commercial, and perhaps even more importantly, on both a cultural and historical level. With his staff of in-house writers, producers, and session musicians, Berry Gordy led a factory-like hit machine out of Detroit that smoothed the rough edges of black music, particularly R&B and soul, and presented it not just to black Americans, but to the white mainstream in an irresistible, polished package. In the early 1960s, even in a clean, smooth, slick form, the music of the likes of Marvin Gaye, Smokey Robinson, the Temptations, the Four Tops, and the Supremes burst out of the speakers with an emotional weight and a sophisticated musical power that little else in American music at the time, except for the Beatles, could match, unless it came from independent labels that other independent labels that featured African-American R&B soul artists such as Stax or King Records. Coinciding with the rise and normalization of the civil rights movement, Motown became more than just a record label. It was in itself a style of music, a lifestyle, and a symbol of black empowerment and self-sufficiency. The Motown logo wasn't just a symbol of musical quality. It was a badge of ethnic pride in a kind of music that was slowly changing the world in more ways than people knew, both in the short and long term. Berry Gordy started in the music business as part of a songwriting team alongside his sister Gwen Gordy and a guy named Billy Davis that collaborated with Detroit-based singer Jackie Wilson. Between 1957 and 58, Gordy and his team wrote several R&B chart hits for Wilson and other artists. Over that time, Gordy also became a producer, producing tracks for a teenaged Smokey Robinson and his then doo-wop group The Miracles, as well as writing and producing for other Detroit area singers. All these songs were licensed to various independent labels throughout the country. But in 1959, Gordy decided to start his own indie label and formed Anna Records, named after his younger sister Anna, who would go on to marry Marvin Gaye. Gordy either wrote or co-wrote as well as produced over 24 successful charting singles in the R&B chart from 1959 to 60, with Barrett Strong's timeless classic Money, That's What I Want being the biggest hit, number 2 R&B, number 23 in the pop chart. Success led Gordy to form another label imprint, Tamla, and along with Anna Records got put under the umbrella of quote-unquote Motown, which meant Motor Town for short, alluding to the fact that Detroit was at the time the leading car manufacturing city in the country. They handled their own local distribution, while Chicago's famous Chess Records distributed Motown's records on a national level during this time. Around this time, Gordy purchased an old photography studio on 2648 West Grand Boulevard and converted it into Motown's very own studio. Motown became very much a self-sustained, family-based company. A young 20-year-old Smokey Robinson became vice president, and many of Gordy's family members, including his father, his brothers Robert and George, and his sisters Esther, Anna, and Gwen, had prominent roles in the company. Just between 1959 and 64, Motown had an astonishing run of hit singles, and more would come in the ensuing years. In addition to Barrett Strong's Money in 1959, there were, check this out, Smokey Robinson and the Miracles' Shop Around from 1960, #1 R&B, #2 pop, and my personal favorite, You Really Got a Hold on Me from 1962, #1 R&B, #8 pop. You have The Marvelettes, Please Mr. Postman from 1961, #1 R&B, #1 pop. Marvin Gaye's Pride and Joy from 1963, #2 R&B, #10 pop. And of course, How Sweet It Is to Be Loved by You from 1964, #3 R&B, #6 pop. The Contours, Do You Love Me? That one from 1962, #1 R&B, #3 pop. I think Berry Gordy wrote that song. Mary Wells's The One Who Really Loves You, #2 R&B, #8 pop. You Beat Me to the Punch, #1 R&B and #9 pop. And Two Lovers, #1 R&B, #7 pop, all from 1962. The Four Tops, Baby I Need Your Lovin' from 1964, #1 R&B and #11 pop. The Temptations, The Way You Do the Things You Do, #1 R&B, #11 pop. And of course, My Girl, My Girl, My Girl, #1 R&B, #1 pop, both from 1964. Martha and the Vandellas, Dancing in the Street from 1964, #8 R&B, #2 pop. The Supremes with Diana Ross and the Supremes with Where Did Our Love Go? #1 R&B, #1 pop. Baby Love, My Baby Love, #1 R&B, #1 pop. And Come See About Me, #2 R&B, #1 pop, all from 1964. By 1964, Motown was not only the supreme independent label in the US, it was arguably the best record label in the whole damn country. Chris?
Arguably the whole damn world. Because, I mean, essentially, I don't think there's ever been more talent in one place gathered together. Like you said, you had the factory line with Smokey Robinson, you had Barrett and Strong, and you had Norman Whitfield, you had all these amazing writers, Berry Gordy, all in one place, Marvin Gaye. I mean, just an absolutely incredible assembly of talent. And just the fact that you have a single calendar year in 1964, you named them all, but I'm going to name them again because it's worth mentioning. In the same friggin' year, the same label and the same studio and the same people produced My Guy, The Way You Do the Things You Do, Where Did Our Love Go, Baby I Need Your Loving, Dancing in the Street, Baby Love, Come See About Me, How Sweet It Is to Be Loved by You, and My Girl. All of those songs arguably belong on a list of the top 100 singles in the history of the U.S. charts, and they all came out in the same year from the same place. And here's one of the more fascinating facts that you'll ever see in all of rock and roll. This something that Rolling Stone reported or came out of an interview with Smokey. Smokey Robinson wrote My Guy and My Girl on the same day. You imagine those are like two of the best songs imaginable, and he wrote them on the same day.
Yeah.
So
he was one of Bob Dylan's favorite lyricists.
Yeah, he was a lyricist, but he's one of the top 5 songwriters ever lived. That guy like wakes up in the morning and like he probably still writes hit songs in his head. Too bad they can't escape his weave. Sorry, Smokey, but that's like the worst weave ever. But just a remarkable this is why I'm saying that 64 was such an important year, because man, so many companies licensed so many of those songs, and I think collectively it's probably fair to say. I mean, 66 is a pretty damn good year, but they probably made more money from their 1964 hits than any of their other years, maybe even
Yeah.
combined.
Yeah, they may have set Barry Gordy for life.
Well, yeah, I mean, well, Barry Gordy was set for life even before he came in 1964, but he was really, 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 really set for life.
Yeah.
And Smokey for sure came out of that year very, very set for life too, because he wrote most of those songs.
Royalties.
Yeah, I was going to say most of the songs you mentioned or that we just mentioned from 64, he wrote or had a hand in writing. So really just a remarkable, remarkable legacy. And, you're still feeling that now. And think about it, even from here, they were a launching pad for Stevie Wonder before Stevie became Stevie, or the Stevie of the 70s. They were a launching pad for Michael Jackson. They just were an incubator for stars, an incubator for songwriters, an incubator for legends. They just had the magic touch up there. Either that or like Detroit just had a lot of fucking awesome people in it.
Yeah. By the way, Aretha Franklin was from Detroit.
Yep.
Motown passed on her.
Whoops.
And she was signed by Atlantic. They could have had Aretha Franklin too.
Yeah, and they also passed on George Clinton.
Really? Yeah, that's true.
And he was a Detroit guy too. So yeah, needless to say, there were a couple of spots they missed. And man, they could have signed the MC5 too.
Can you imagine the MC5 on Motown? Kick out the jams, motherfucker.
Yeah. yeah, but put some swing into it. Get what's his name there, James Jamerson on bass. Oh brother. On that note, we go from one titanic slice of black music majesty in 1964 to another. Correct, Arturo?
Yeah, Sam Cooke.
Yep.
The year he died.
Yes. He had Sam Cooke is an extraordinary figure in the history of R&B, rock and roll, whatever you want to call it, because of his rise and fall, but also, he had an interesting arc. He really stands along with James Brown as one of the artists who most successfully built a bridge from the first golden age of rock into the second one.
Yeah.
And because, he has his roots as a gospel singer, and then he was he was almost a crooner, but a very gentle progenitor of R&B songs, stuff like Wonderful World, don't know much about history.
Yeah.
And, You Send Me and stuff like that. But coming into 64, now, one thing to say, Sam Cooke had an awesomely triumphant year in 1964, and 1964 was the year he was murdered. And so that just shows you, like, when we think about Sam Cooke, it's really the 64 Sam Cooke that is the legacy Sam Cooke that has been revered. Now, Sam started the year on the verge of breaking through into absolute pop superstardom among an affluent white audience. And at the time, the record industry saw the Copacabana in New York as a bit of a holy grail of pop glory. If you could play the Copacabana and entertain that highfalutin audience, you had made it. And so Elvis had played the Copa. Like Sammy Davis Jr. was a veteran of the Copa. And so if you made it into the Copa, you were a made man for life. And this was basically Sam and his manager, the notorious Alan Klein's, sort of their mission in life was to get the Sam played the Copa in 1968 and bombed badly. And so their mission in life was to get Sam back to the Copa.
Wait, you mean 1958, you mean?
58, yes. In 1958. Thank you, sir. It was not Back to the Future. 1958.
Yeah.
And he bombed so bad that it was their mission in life to get him back there and to succeed. And so he started the year on the verge of that, and also releasing his finest album. He was basically being positioned by RCA as a superstar. And unfortunately, the year ended, both fortunately and unfortunately, it ended with him standing as a galvanizing figure for the civil rights movement and for the
Yeah.
soul of Black people in the United States.
Yeah, he was getting really active in the civil rights movement at the time of his death.
Oh yeah, I mean, if anybody's seen the movie One Night in Miami, that really
Yeah.
details it pretty well. Anyway, so a lot of the detail that I'm using here comes from I mentioned it earlier, Peter Guralnick, who's like one of the foremost authors and biographers and chroniclers of early rock and roll and what's known as vernacular music. He wrote an awesome biography some years back on Cooke called Dream Boogie. Now, there were two album releases that Cooke had in '64. The first, which came out early in the year, was Ain't That Good News. And this was Cooke at his most liberated and his most expressive. Before then, he had kind of kept it polished, but through his success had won some newfound artistic freedom, and this was his chance to use it. And so he kind of formatted it as one of those Ray Charles country records where side one, you get the rollicking up tempo stuff, and side two, you get the more ballady, sort of more crooned and frankly wider side. And so, to look at this side one, my personal favorite song on that is this really fun little hip shaker called Another Saturday Night, in which the notoriously womanizing Cooke wrote this song to basically channel his anger or his lamentations at a time that he was stuck in his hotel room and unable to go out and get laid. And he was a notorious womanizer, as we'll find out here in a bit. Now, side two was slower and richer and lovelier. It includes an Irving Berlin cover, and it's mostly covers. But side two also starts with his best and most important song, A Change Is Gonna Come, which the label initially didn't believe in. It was originally a B-side, but Klein convinced Cooke to play it as part of his appearance on the Johnny Carson show early in '64, or the Tonight Show, and it kind of took off from there. The song is really an autobiographical tale of him growing up Black and in the South. I mean, it kind of combines imagery from both Mississippi and Chicago. And the song became a real anthem and hope of it really became an anthem of hope and transcendence for people deeply involved in the battle for civil rights for Black people. As we touched upon early in the history of this podcast, we did an episode on Dylan covers. Cooke wrote A Change Is Gonna Come. It was basically, he had a fit of indignation that a white guy, Bob Dylan, had written the preeminent civil rights protest song "Blowing in the Wind." And he's like, wait a second, that motherfucker wrote that and he ain't Black. Well, okay, well, now we need ours. And so Sam and his swagger wrote that song. So now, around the time of the release of Ain't That Good News, Cooke realized that life's dream and took up a 2-week residency at the Copa, which at that time, like I had said, was seen as a validating mark for joining that Elvis and Sammy Davis set among star singers as well, but star singers. And so with Ain't That Good News and A Change Is Gonna Come, coupled with this residency at the Copa and the live album that came out of it, which originally they were not going to do a live record, but the president of RCA insisted upon it and saying, why the hell do you think we've invested all this money in this guy if we didn't think he was going to be a breakout superstar? So of course we're going to release a fucking live album. Are you nuts? And so they came out with that, and it became a hit. Really great performance. He was a song and dance man. Not just he was a consummate showman in addition to being a wonderful singer. And so he obviously, I don't know if he did it for irony's sake, but he includes a really schmaltzy, loungy take on "Blowing in the Wind," which we talked about in that episode from years ago at this point. But really, really good stuff. And then Cooke was murdered. So let me we'll talk about this a little bit. The incident that led to his death became fodder for conspiracy theories for years and years. And Muhammad Ali was actually quoted at a memorial service for Cooke, saying that if Cooke was white, someone would definitely have been in jail. Regardless, I would like to read at length Garalnik's account of the terrible incident that took Cooke's life. It's kind of hard to believe when you read it and when you look at it. So here you go. So whatever the case, Sam was enraged. The girl who he had brought back to his room and had left had his clothes, and the girl had his money. Did she think that he was just going to let her play him like this? He went back to the kitchen of the hotel he was staying at, its office, and the bedroom of the small apartment. And when he did not find her there, he grabbed the manager, who, though she was only 5'6", at nearly 190 pounds, outweighed Sam by a good 25 or 30. He was so angry he could scarcely remember who he was. He shook the woman by the shoulders as if he could wring the information out of her. She fought back, and they got into an awkward wrestling match and fell onto the floor. She was biting and scratching, and when she finally got out from under him, she went for the gun. He must have really realized immediately how desperate the situation was. But how many times had he been in situations no less desperate and emerged unscathed by dint of luck, pluck, or simply because he was Sam Cooke? There was a flash and a report as they struggled for the gun, and a bullet went into the ceiling. There was a second discharge, and he was still standing. The third bullet tore through both lungs, the heart, and lodged near his right shoulder blade as blood splattered all over the woman's dress. "Well, lady, you shot me," he said with a combination of astonishment, bewilderment, and disbelief. In Bertha Lee Franklin's recollection, that was her name, Bertha Lee Franklin, he ran at her once again, and she picked up a stick and hit him over the head with it so hard that it broke in two. So that's how Sam died. It started with him bringing a girl, probably a prostitute, back to his room, getting rough with her. And so I think in her mind, she was about to be raped. And so she was able to escape the room. And in escaping the room, she took all of Sam's clothes except for his suit jacket and apparently his money. And so he is, meanwhile, in the midst of this, the darkly funny part is he's out there raging at this woman that shot him, wearing nothing but his suit jacket.
And nothing beneath, nothing underneath. Wow.
Nothing underneath. And so, so basically it was enough to just kind of sort of cover his dick. And so it's just a crazy incident. Now, the reason it became a conspiracy theory is because the people close to him insisted that Cooke always carried like thousands of dollars in cash on him. And when they found his wallet in the young lady's purse, there was no money in it. And so they think something more nefarious happened. But so it really is pretty awful what happened to him. And so, you get that, you get this where Cooke does his greatest work and leaves his greatest legacy, and he makes it as a superstar, and then is murdered in such a grotesque fashion that it leads to these conspiracy theories. And so, like I said, he entered the year on the verge of white splendor. He ended the year as basically a Black American icon for both his contributions to the civil rights movement and the song "A Change Is Gonna Come," but also the really kind of weird circumstances around his death and some of the controversies around that maybe this was him being done in by white America. So anyway, despite the tragic ending, Cooke, he was that bridge guy from the first golden age into the second, taking his gospel and sweet soul croonings and giving them an edge that set the table for Aretha Franklin, the second chapter of James Brown, and many, many others. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Sam Cooke. Arturo?
Yeah, why do you think he isn't as remembered as much as some of his peers?
Uh, that's a good question. He should be. I think as time fades, I mean, I think there's a certain, I will say One Night in Miami did lead to a little bit of a comeback in interest in Sam Cooke here in the last couple of years in the States. And that's because Leslie Odom got nominated for an Oscar for his performance in that. And so there's been an uptick. A Change Is Gonna Come has become fodder for mass covers.
Right.
It actually had a little bit of a revival about 15 years ago when Adam Lambert, of all people, did a weird cover of it on American Idol. And so it's become, that song has grown in stature. But like you said, I think that between James Brown and I think that folks like Al Green and Donny Hathaway, especially because of all the sampling that goes on with Donny, Otis Redding, because of all the sampling that Kanye samples the shit out of Otis Redding. And then folks like Bill Withers and Bobby Blue Bland. These folks have kind of taken more prominence. And again, I think it's because of the hip hop generation and the hip hop sampling and the reverence. I mean, Sam Cooke does not lend himself, his music and catalog doesn't lend itself as well to sampling as that. But also, if you think about it, Sam Cooke was so good. Wouldn't you be intimidated if you tried to cover a Sam Cooke song?
Yeah, he was a hell of a singer. He's kind of hard. You can't really cover him very well.
Yeah, well, he was a hell of a singer.
Rod Stewart tried.
Yeah, he's a hell of a singer and a hell of a writer, too. He wrote most of his hits he wrote. I mean, I've always been a huge fan of Wonderful World. I think that's one of the great singles of that era, for sure. But yeah, that 1964 record, Ain't That Good News, that is a very, very, very strong record. And Sam was a star. And he was only going to become a bigger star. He was going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And at the time, one of the reasons he was going to get bigger, he would have gotten more controversial because he had hitched his wagon to Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali. And he had, and he had a deep association with those two guys. And so he was, I think by the end of the 60s, he would have been one of the great stars in America. And so it's a real tragedy that we really didn't get there.
Yeah, it's a shame. And there is another sad shame with the next artist we're going to talk about, but it won't happen in this episode. It'll happen in a future episode of this series later on, because the sad story of Brian Wilson is a long-term one, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
The Beach Boys. In the late 1950s, Link Wray and Duane Eddy, probably without knowing of each other, each developed a style of instrumental rock and roll that was captivating and visceral, as well as commercially successful. With its foreboding menace and twangy tone, that instrumental rock sound captured the imaginations of aspiring guitarists everywhere. Once its popularity made it to the American West Coast, particularly in California, some creative musicians decided to do something with it that became an underrated seismic change in rock history. Groups like The Ventures and Dick Dale and the Deltones adapted Ray's and Eddie's innovations into innovations of their own. The result was what eventually became known as surf rock or surf music. Basically, this was music as the accompanying soundtrack, whether in your imagination or actually coming out of the radio at the time, to surf parties. Young, muscular, tanned men hanging out with young, lithe, tanned women, all either enjoying the surf and the sun by day or hanging around a bonfire on the beach with booze, the little weed, and some extracurricular activities going on, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, sounds like a Hulk Hogan video from the mid-90s.
You know what I mean, brother. Surf music and the culture of surfing surrounding it quickly became part of the great California myth that has been a part of the American consciousness since the era of Manifest Destiny and the USA's westward expansion. In 1961, in a suburb of Los Angeles called Hawthorne, a young group of brothers named Brian, Dennis, and Carl Wilson, along with their cousin Mike Love and high school buddy Al Jardine, decided to take surf music and the mythos surrounding it and do something radical with it. Brian, the band leader and figurehead of the group, was enamored with vocal harmony pop, especially such pop informed by doo-wop and folk music. His ingenious idea, with urging from his surfing aficionado brother Dennis and rock and roll loving brother Carl, was to merge this kind of music with surf rock, particularly with surf rock's rock and roll and R&B underpinnings. Essentially, the idea was to drastically reduce the guitar solos, emphasize melody and what would become the group's famously lush and complex vocal harmonies, and in the process, turn surf rock into irresistible pop music. The result was just as inventive, innovative, and revolutionary as Bob Dylan's injection of literary lyricism into pop music and the Beatles' sophisticated reinvention of rock and roll. In late 1961, the nascent Beach Boys released the naively charming single Surfin' on a local independent label Candix, and it became such a huge regional hit in the Southern California area that it was able to reach number 75 on the Billboard pop chart. This was enough to earn the band a record deal with Capitol Records, and in 1962, the classic Surfin' Safari was released, reaching all the way to number 14 on the pop chart, and the Beach Boys were now the country's preeminent surf rock / pop group. In 1963, the band refashioned Chuck Berry's Sweet Little 16 into the rousing anthem Surfin' USA, which hit number 3, followed by the beautiful tender ballad Surfer Girl, which went to number 7. The beauty of these early surf rock singles of the Beach Boys is that they were able to sell the California myth of surf, sun, fast cars, and fast women to the rest of America as well as any Hollywood movie. It didn't matter how landlocked or how small your town was. Surfing wasn't just surfing. It was a metaphor for how to live your life to its fullest, as well as to live the life you want, not the one you have.
Yep.
Coming into 1964, Brian Wilson, who wrote all the music with substantial lyrical help from Mike Love, and arranged and produced all the records, became obsessed with making his version of the dense, booming wall of sound that producer Phil Spector had so expertly crafted earlier in the decade with female pop groups such as the Ronettes and the Crystals. One of the ways Spector got his famous sound seemed simple enough. He just doubled or even tripled all the instruments, doubled or triple tracked them. Instead of 2 guitars, bring in 4 guitars playing at the same time. Instead of 1 bass, bring in 2 or 3 bass players to play at the same time. Always have at least 2 drummers, and so on and so on. That's one of the ways Wilson approached the Beach Boys' music of 1964. And the new approach resulted in some of the most thrilling, joyous, expertly crafted, and subtly complex pop music ever made. The band pinched another Chuck Berry riff for the honky-tonk stomper Fun, 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 which hit number 5 on the pop chart. That was followed by I Get Around, which showcased Wilson's ability to not just perfectly emulate Spector's style, but transcend it with a searing stop and start song structure and gorgeous harmony vocals that soar the song and the track into the sky. It was their first number 1 hit. By the end of 1964, the Beach Boys were the only American rock group that could credibly compete with the Beatles and the British invasion onslaught. Unfortunately, also by the end of 64, Brian Wilson, who in addition to his writing and production duties was also a touring member of the band, playing bass and sharing lead vocals, It was around this time that Wilson psychologically cracked under the pressure, suffering a severe panic attack and nervous breakdown in an airplane as the band were taking off for a brief tour. Really, unfortunately, this would portend the severe mental health issues Wilson would have several years down the road, of course, exacerbated by his excessive drug use, which would result in an even worse mental and emotional breakdown. However, that's a story for another day or another episode. In 1964, though, things were only pointing up for the Beach Boys. Chris?
Yeah, they were and up and up and up and up. Like you said, everything just soared. Imagine this, a single released in May of 64, A-side, I Get Around, B-side, Don't Worry, Baby.
Yeah.
That ain't
Awesome.
bad. That ain't bad.
Yeah. Don't Worry, Baby's a beautiful song.
Oh, it's gorgeous. And that was probably his best capturing of the wall of sound.
Yeah.
I think he really nailed it to the point where no joke, up until about 10 years ago, I legitimately thought that was like a Ronettes cover or like a Phil Spector girl group cover, because it was so well done. And Wilson at this point, he's one of the great appropriators in the history of because he was so
Hello, Chuck Berry.
Yeah, well, there was that. Well, not only that, but Phil Spector and the doo-wop groups and all that. But he was so damn good at the arranging and capturing the pure joy of the music. Yeah. And like I Get Around is just an incredible song. I mean, that 5-part harmony on that, and that falsetto that Wilson was capable of, and the fact that he is able to it's got that clap and that stomp to it and that rhythm, and it's just such a great sing-along. And it also has one of Mike Love's better lead vocals, as I want to say, and I've said this throughout this podcast on several episodes. Say what you want about Mike Love, the asshole, but boy, could that guy sing. He's one of the greatest lead singers in the history of rock and roll. He was a special singer. And as it turns out, he was a great lyricist about girls and cars. Yeah. He just had a gift for that California beach life and capturing that in words. And I will say this, thank God for the Beach Boys, because otherwise we would have been stuck with Jan and fucking Dean.
Who had a big hit with a Brian Wilson song.
Yeah, that the two girls for every boy. Yeah, that's
Jan and Dean.
Yeah, and that Jan, whatever his name was, he actually co-wrote that song with Brian Wilson. Surf and Safari was the name of that song. So yeah, I mean, this is the period that, I mean, I'm much fonder, like 1965, 66 Beach Boys, like when he starts doing like Help Me Rhonda and some of the Baroque stuff. When it's when he turns Baroque that he turns into a true genius. But man, this period is just so much fun. And there's a reason that Mike Love has been able to make a gazillion dollars keeping the touring business, Beach Boys Inc. alive. And it's because these songs are just, you can't help but smile.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, you can't help but smile.
That's what they're for. It's the California myth put to music.
Yeah. So absolutely. So like I said, we go from the apotheosis of black music hitting the mainstream in 64 to the apotheosis of American white people hitting the big time in 1964. And so I guess that's one of the themes of 64 is that sort
change. It's change.
It's change. And I'll let you talk about that in a second, but also the racial equity too. I don't think you had a more racially equitable year in pop music up until that point ever.
Right.
Is that a fair statement?
And, yeah, for sure.
With that said, folks, as we always end these episodes with, we have our curmudgeonly community alive and well on Facebook. You can find us there, facebook.com/groups/curmudgeonrock. Arturo just rolled out his list for 1976, which is comically short. Not a deep bench for albums that year, so I had a good laugh on that. And thank you as always to Paul and Daniel for their contributions to the discussion there. We'd love to get more of you involved. You listening, join the group and invite all your friends, and we'll have soda and pie, as the Beastie Boys once said. Also, if you have any thoughts about this episode, any complaints, or you just want to call us two random assholes, you can hit us up at curmudgeonrock@gmail.com. And we're on Twitter still, although Twitter is now X officially. But, so we have a presence there. A couple of great feeds that I want to just give a quick shout out to. Stephen Hayden, who's a music journalist, a wonderful music journalist. He has a wonderful feed. Brian Hyatt of Rolling Stone has a tremendous feed. And on the artist side, my favorite artist these days is Jason Isbell. Somebody posed the question as to what song would you love to hear Bruce Springsteen cover, and he answered it with WAP.